The morning Clara Ashford arrived at Whitmore Hall, she counted 17 rooms that belonged to her, 4 gardens her mother had planted by hand, and 1 duke who dropped a pair of muddy riding boots at her feet without ever looking at her face. She picked them up. She had her reasons. The carriage that carried Clara to Whitmore Hall was not grand. It was hired, modest, and slightly damp from the morning rain. Exactly the kind of carriage a woman of no particular consequence would arrive in. That was intentional. Clara had dressed carefully that morning. Not poorly, she was not performing poverty, but plainly. A gray traveling dress. Hair pinned without ornament. No jewelry except the small ring on her right hand, turned inward so the stone didn't show. She had looked at herself in the mirror of the inn where she'd spent the night and decided she looked precisely like what she needed to look like, unremarkable. The gates of Whitmore Hall appeared through the carriage window just after 9 in the morning, and Clara felt something shift in her chest, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. She had not been here since she was 12 years old. She had stood in this same drive, holding her father's hand, watching the leaves come down from the old elm trees that still lined the approach. The elm trees were still there. Everything else felt different because everything else was. Her father was dead. And the house, her mother's house, the house her grandfather had built stone by stone, was currently occupied by a duke who had no idea she existed. The carriage stopped. Clara stepped out before the driver could assist her, which was not the behavior of a hired companion, but she caught herself and slowed. She looked up at the front entrance of Whitmore Hall and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel whatever it was she was feeling. Then she put it away. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a stout woman in her 50s named Mrs. Drummond. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes moved over Clara with the particular efficiency of a woman who categorized people quickly and rarely revised her opinions. Clara let her look. She smiled politely. She said her name was Miss Clara Ashford, that she had been sent in response to the advertisement for a lady's companion, and that she hoped she had not arrived at an inconvenient hour. Mrs. Drummond said the hour was fine and led her inside. The entrance hall of Whitmore Hall smelled of beeswax and old stone, and something faintly floral that Clara recognized immediately. Her mother had kept dried lavender in the wall cabinet beside the door. Someone still did. Clara did not look at the cabinet. She looked straight ahead and followed Mrs. Drummond across the hall toward the east corridor, where the housekeeper explained, in a tone that suggested she was accustomed to explaining things to people who did not retain information, that His Grace was occupied this morning, that Clara's duties would be outlined later in the day, and that she would be shown to her room presently. They had made it approximately halfway down the east corridor when the door to the left opened. He was taller than Clara had expected. She wasn't sure why she had formed any expectation at all. She had never met the Duke of Whitmore, had only heard him described in her uncle's letters as a man of considerable property and considerable pride and very little patience. The description, she would later reflect, had been accurate on all 3 counts. He came out of the room with the particular energy of a man who had somewhere to be and was already mildly irritated about it. He was pulling on his riding gloves. He didn't look up immediately. Mrs. Drummond stiffened with the instinctive deference of long service. Clara stood still. The Duke finally looked up at Mrs. Drummond, not at Clara, and said, "The boots from this morning are still in the stable passage. Have someone see to them." His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who expected to be heard. Mrs. Drummond said, "Yes, Your Grace," automatically. Then the Duke's gaze moved briefly, almost accidentally, to Clara. He took her in the way one takes in a piece of furniture, present, noted, categorically assigned. His expression didn't change. He reached back through the open door, produced a pair of riding boots genuinely muddy, the kind of mud that came from a hard morning ride across wet fields, and held them out in Clara's direction without a word. The assumption was complete and uncomplicated. She was staff. The boots needed cleaning. The logic was immediate and required no discussion. Clara looked at the boots. She thought of 17 rooms. She thought of 4 gardens. She thought of the ring on her right hand, turned so the stone didn't show. She took the boots. The Duke was already walking away, still adjusting his gloves. Mrs. Drummond watched him go, then turned to look at Clara with an expression that was not unkind but was also not apologetic. Clara held the muddy boots and said nothing. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Drummond said quietly. "Thank you," Clara said. "That would be very kind." She followed the housekeeper up the stairs, boots in hand, and did not look back at the corridor. She did not need to. She knew this house the way she knew her own name, every turning, every staircase, every room behind every door. She had learned it as a child, running through these halls while her father worked in the study at the end of the west wing, and her mother cut flowers in the garden below the south window. The room Mrs. Drummond brought her to was small and clean and faced the rear garden. Clara set the boots down beside the washstand, removed her gloves, and went to the window. Below, the south garden was slightly overgrown. The roses her mother had planted along the far wall had not been properly cut back. Clara pressed one hand against the cool glass and looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned away, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and reached into the inner pocket of her traveling coat. She withdrew a letter folded, sealed with plain wax, addressed in her father's handwriting. She had read it 4 times already. She knew what it said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she smiled, small and private and entirely her own. She had not come to Whitmore Hall because she had nowhere else to go. She had not come because she was desperate or frightened or without options. She had come because her father's letter had told her exactly where to look, and because some things, some truths, some inheritances, some debts of justice, could only be claimed in person. She set the letter on the bed beside her, stood up, and picked up the muddy boots. She supposed she might as well clean them. She had time. She was in no hurry at all. Clara had cleaned the boots. She had done it thoroughly and without resentment, the way she did most things, with the quiet patience of someone who understood that the present moment was not the final one. She had returned them to the stable passage before noon, set them neatly on the rack, and said nothing to anyone about where they had come from or who had handed them to her. That afternoon, Mrs. Drummond gave her a brief outline of her duties. She was to attend to Lady Whitmore, the Duke's mother, who resided in the West Wing and suffered from what Mrs. Drummond described carefully as fluctuating nerves, for several hours each morning. She was to be available for correspondence assistance in the afternoons. She was to take her meals in the housekeeper's sitting room, not the kitchen and not the dining room. She was to keep herself unobtrusive. Clara said she understood completely. She spent her first full day learning the rhythms of the house, not because she needed to, but because she needed to know what had changed. Some things had not. The creaking stair on the east landing was still the 3rd step from the top. The door to the library still required a firm push at the lower left corner to open properly. The light in the south corridor shifted at 4 in the afternoon into something golden and particular that she remembered from childhood without having consciously remembered it at all. And when she turned the corner and walked into it on that first afternoon, she had to stop for a moment and simply stand in it. She recovered quickly. No one saw. What was different? The study at the end of the West Wing, her father's study, the room where he had worked for 30 years, had been repaneled. The furniture was different. The smell was different. Clara stood in the doorway on the second morning, under the pretense of delivering a message from Lady Whitmore, and looked at the room for exactly as long as was natural, and then she moved on. Other things were harder to explain. On her second morning, she was crossing the rear courtyard when the old gardener appeared from behind the kitchen garden wall. His name was Phelps. He had worked at Whitmore Hall for over 40 years. He was well past the age when most men of his profession had retired, and he moved with the particular slowness of someone whose joints had decades of weather in them. Clara had known him since she was a girl. He had taught her the names of every rose variety along the south wall. He had let her ride in the wheelbarrow when she was 6, and her mother had been watching from the window above and had pretended not to see. When Phelps saw Clara crossing the courtyard, he stopped. He looked at her for a moment, a long, still, assessing look, and then he removed his hat. Not a nod, not a small acknowledgement of a passing household employee. He removed his hat and held it to his chest, the way a man does when he is paying a particular kind of respect. Clara met his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head, barely a movement at all. A message, not yet. Phelps put his hat back on. He said, "Morning, miss," in exactly the tone of a gardener greeting a companion, and went back to his work. But that evening, Clara found a small bunch of roses from the south wall on the windowsill of her room. They were tied with a piece of garden twine. They were the same variety her mother had planted. She put them in the water glass beside her bed and did not cry. She had made an agreement with herself about crying, and she intended to keep it. The cook, a wide, warm woman named Mrs. Beale, who had been at Whitmore Hall for 20 years and ran the kitchen with the authority of a minor general, presented a more complicated situation. Mrs. Beale had not known Clara as a child. She had arrived after Clara's family had last been in residence. She had no reason to recognize her. And yet, on the third morning, Clara came down to collect Lady Whitmore's breakfast tray, as was her duty, and found that the tray held not the standard modest portions set aside for household staff, but a full and generous breakfast, soft rolls, good butter, a small pot of the expensive tea that was kept locked in the pantry, and a dish of preserved plums that Mrs. Beale produced only for guests of consequence. Clara looked at the tray. She looked at Mrs. Beale, who was standing at the range with her back turned. "Mrs. Beale," Clara said carefully, "I believe this may be the wrong tray." "No, miss," said Mrs. Beale without turning around. "That's yours." Clara said nothing for a moment. "I'm the companion," she said. "I take my meals in the—" "You take what I give you," said Mrs. Beale, pleasantly and with complete finality, and turned around with an expression that dared Clara to continue the conversation. Clara took the tray. She did not ask how Mrs. Beale knew. Some things in old houses moved through the walls like warmth through stone, slowly, invisibly, but thoroughly. The house knew her. She had not fully anticipated that, and it moved her more than she had expected. It also made her careful, because the house was not the only one paying attention. She first noticed it on the 4th day. She was in the east corridor. She had been walking slowly, allowing herself the private indulgence of moving through familiar space, when she became aware that she was not alone. She turned. The Duke was standing at the far end of the corridor. He was not walking toward her. He was simply there, still, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not suspicion exactly. More like the look of a man who has noticed something that doesn't fit the category he has assigned it to, and isn't sure yet whether to revise the category or ignore the anomaly. Clara met his gaze. She did not look away first, which she suspected was not what he expected. After a moment, he walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with that same assessing expression. Then his gaze moved past her to the wall beside her. Clara turned slightly to follow his gaze and felt her breath stop for just one instant. The portrait was there. She had not walked far enough down the corridor to reach it, had not seen it yet, but here it was directly beside her. It was covered with a heavy cloth, as portraits sometimes were when households changed hands. But the frame was visible, and the frame was gilded, and the shape beneath the cloth was unmistakably a woman, 3/4 length, the posture particular and familiar. Clara's hand moved before she could stop it. Just slightly, a small, instinctive reach toward the frame, the way one reaches toward something one has been missing without quite knowing it. She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. The Duke had seen. "You know that portrait," he said. It was not quite a question. Clara turned back to him. Her voice was even. "I was admiring the frame," she said. "It's very fine work." The Duke looked at her. He clearly did not believe her, and he clearly was not sure what the truth was instead, and that uncertainty sat on him with visible discomfort. "The portrait is covered," he said, "because the subject is not relevant to the current household." "Of course," Clara said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked away. Clara stood in the corridor alone. She turned back to the portrait. She looked at the shape beneath the cloth, the line of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, the particular way the painted figure stood as if she owned every inch of the ground beneath her feet. She reached out and touched the corner of the frame, just once. "Soon," she said quietly, to herself, to the portrait, to the house around her that already knew her name. She straightened her skirt and walked on. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her room and opened her father's letter one more time. She did not read it. She only looked at his handwriting, the firm, unhurried hand of a man who had trusted that the right things would find their way to the right places, if one was patient enough to let them. The document room was at the end of the west wing, 2 doors past the repaneled study. She had walked past it 3 times now without stopping. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She knew approximately where it would be if her uncle had not already found it. She did not think he had, not yet. But she had perhaps a week before his next visit. She had learned that much from Lady Whitmore, who spoke freely and without awareness that her companion was listening to every word with particular care. A week was enough. She folded the letter, placed it back in her pocket, and blew out the candle. Outside her window, the south garden was dark, and the roses along the far wall were invisible in the night. But she knew they were there. She could be patient. She had been patient for a very long time. The Duke's name was James. Clara had known this from her uncle's letters, from the legal correspondence she had read carefully before leaving London, from the dry and factual documents that described the temporary ducal management of the Ashford estate in language so bloodless it might have been describing the transfer of livestock. James Whitmore, 5th Duke of Whitmore, 34 years old, unmarried, returned from 8 months on the continent 6 weeks before Clara's arrival. Financially solvent but not, her sources suggested, comfortably so. She did not think of him as James. She thought of him as the Duke, which kept things appropriately ordered in her mind. He was not, in her categorization, a villain. She had met her uncle, and she knew what a villain looked like. The Duke was something more inconvenient, a man of ordinary assumptions and considerable power who had walked into a situation he did not fully understand and was making decisions based on incomplete information. She could work with that. What she could not work with was malice, and she had not yet seen malice in him. Arrogance, yes. Indifference, certainly, but not malice. She revised her assessment slightly at the end of her first week, during the afternoon when Lord Hensley came to call. Lord Hensley was a neighbor of sorts. His estate bordered the Whitmore land to the north, and he visited with the comfortable frequency of a man who considered himself welcome everywhere. He was perhaps 50, broad through the chest, with the particular brand of good humor that sits on men who have never been told no with any conviction. He arrived for luncheon and stayed well into the afternoon, and at some point during that afternoon, Clara was required to pass through the drawing room where the 2 men were drinking the Duke's brandy and discussing nothing of consequence. She moved through the room quietly, as she had learned to move through all rooms in this house, present but unobtrusive, visible but not demanding of attention. She was nearly to the other door when Lord Hensley noticed her. "Who's this?" he said, in the tone of a man commenting on something mildly diverting. Clara stopped and turned. She said nothing. She waited. The Duke glanced at her with the brief neutrality he generally applied to her existence. "The companion," he said, "for my mother." "Is she?" Lord Hensley looked at Clara with an attention that was entirely different from the Duke's indifference and considerably less comfortable. He smiled. "Come here, then." Clara did not move. The smile on Lord Hensley's face shifted slightly, not disappearing, but adjusting to accommodate mild surprise. Men like Lord Hensley were not accustomed to stillness in response to their instructions. "I said come here," he repeated, pleasantly enough, but with an edge beneath it now. "I heard you," Clara said. Her voice was polite. Her voice was always polite. "I'm afraid I have an errand for Lady Whitmore that requires some urgency. Please excuse me." She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Lord Hensley make a sound of amused indignation and begin to say something. She caught the word *remarkable used in a tone that did not mean remarkable. And then she heard the Duke's voice, even and unhurried, cut across whatever Lord Hensley had intended to say next. "The brandy is from the Nine Estate," the Duke said. "You were telling me about the new fences along your northern boundary." A deliberate redirect, clean and complete. Clara paused in the doorway for just a fraction of a second, long enough to register it, and then she continued through. She stood in the corridor outside and allowed herself to be surprised, not dramatically, just a small, internal revision. She filed it away with care, the way she filed away everything she observed in this house. It did not change her situation. It did not change her plan, but it changed, slightly, the shape of the Duke in her mind. He was not indifferent to everything then. He was selective about what he chose to notice. The question was what, exactly, determined the selection. She found out more that same week. Lady Whitmore was not an unkind woman. She was anxious and exhausting and spoke at considerable length about her nerves and the weather and the deficiencies of the previous companion. But underneath the anxiety she was not unkind. She had taken to Clara with the slightly desperate warmth of a woman who was lonely and intelligent enough to recognize, on some level, that Clara was more than she appeared, without being curious enough to press on why. She talked, Clara listened, and in listening she learned a great deal. She learned that the Duke had been, before his time on the continent, engaged to a Miss Fiona Graves, a match considered suitable by everyone involved. She learned that the engagement had ended under circumstances Lady Whitmore described only as deeply unfortunate, with an expression suggesting she had opinions she had been instructed not to share. She learned that the Duke had returned from the continent quieter than he had left, and that his mother found this worrying in ways she could not articulate beyond the word *quiet repeated at intervals. She also learned, incidentally and with far greater interest, that Clara's uncle had visited Whitmore Hall twice in the past month and was expected again before the end of the fortnight. This she had already known, but the confirmation tightened something in her chest. She had perhaps 10 days. It was during the second week that Lady Cecily arrived. Lady Cecily Aldworth was 26, possessed of genuine beauty and a formidable mother, who had been corresponding with the Duchess Dowager, Lady Whitmore, for the better part of the season. She arrived with a small retinue, a great deal of luggage, and the quietly assured manner of a woman who has been told from childhood that she will make an excellent match, and has organized her entire personality around the achievement of this goal. She was, in a purely technical sense, everything the situation called for. She was well-connected, well-mannered in public, and well-practiced at being exactly what each room required her to be. Clara watched her perform these adjustments with professional admiration and personal wariness, because she had also observed within the first 48 hours that Lady Cecily in private was a rather different proposition than Lady Cecily in the drawing room. In private, Lady Cecily was the kind of woman who spoke to servants with the very particular cruelty of someone who has learned that cruelty to people who cannot answer back carries no social consequence. Her voice dropped when she addressed them. Her eyes went flat. She corrected, criticized, dismissed, not with heat, which might have been forgivable, but with the cold efficiency of someone who had simply never considered that it mattered. Clara she disliked on instinct, the way certain people dislike certain other people before any specific evidence has been gathered. A recognition, perhaps, of something that doesn't fit the expected order. "You," Lady Cecily said on her second evening, catching Clara in the upstairs corridor outside the guest wing. She was dressed for dinner, her hair done to precision, and she looked at Clara with the flat gaze Clara had already come to recognize. "The laces on my left boot are uneven. I noticed it when I stood. Come and fix it." Clara looked at her. She considered briefly the several responses available to her. Then she said, "Of course," and followed Lady Cecily into the guest room. She knelt and fixed the laces. She did it slowly and perfectly, because she did everything slowly and perfectly. And as she worked, Lady Cecily stood above her and looked at herself in the glass and said, almost to herself, "I cannot imagine what the Duke requires a companion for his mother for. The woman seems perfectly capable of boring people to sleep on her own." Clara said nothing. She finished the left lace. She moved to check the right. Lady Cecily glanced down at her with a faint expression of impatience. "You're taking rather long." "I want to make sure they're even," Clara said pleasantly. She finished the right lace. She began to rise, and as she did, she straightened slightly and brought her mouth close to Lady Cecily's ear and said very quietly, very calmly, just 4 sentences, something that made Lady Cecily go absolutely, completely still. The color left her face, not in a flush, not embarrassment, not anger, but in the particular way that color leaves a face when something has been said that the listener did not expect anyone to know, and now must rapidly calculate what the knowing of it means. Clara stepped back and smoothed her skirt. "The laces are even," she said. "Enjoy your dinner, Lady Cecily." She left the room. She closed the door quietly behind her. In the corridor, she walked toward the east staircase with her usual unhurried pace, and she did not look back, and she did not allow herself to smile until she had turned the corner and was entirely alone. It was a small satisfaction. She was not above small satisfactions. They sustained her. Downstairs, the dinner bell rang. Clara went to collect Lady Whitmore, and as she guided the older woman along the corridor toward the dining room, they passed the Duke coming the other way. He glanced at Clara briefly, as he generally did. Then he paused. "Are you well, Miss Ashford?" he said. It was said in the absent, perfunctory tone of someone completing a social formality, but he had stopped, which he did not usually do. Clara looked at him. "Quite well, thank you, Your Grace." He nodded. He moved on. Lady Whitmore patted Clara's arm with the vague warmth of a woman who had not followed the exchange but registered its existence. "He notices more than he lets on," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Clara said nothing, but she thought about it for the rest of the evening. She thought about the redirect in the drawing room. She thought about him stopping in the corridor. She thought about the shape of a man who had been described to her as proud and cold and impatient, and who kept, with stubborn inconsistency, doing things that didn't fit the description. It did not change her plan. She reminded herself of this firmly. But that night, sitting at the small desk in her room with her father's letter and the sound of the wind against the south garden, she allowed herself one question she had not previously asked. What kind of man would he be, she wondered, when he finally knew the truth? She folded the letter. She put it away. She had perhaps 9 days to find out. Clara's uncle arrived on a Tuesday. She knew he was coming before she heard the carriage. She had been watching the drive from Lady Whitmore's sitting room window with the practiced inattention of someone who appeared to be focused entirely on her embroidery. When the carriage appeared through the elm trees, she set her needle down with steady hands and said nothing. Lady Whitmore, who was describing in considerable detail the inadequacy of the previous season's physician, did not notice. His name was Gerald Ashford, her father's younger brother. He had the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into expressions of warmth and openness, which Clara had learned by the age of 14 was the most dangerous kind of face a dishonest man could have. He was 60 now, gray at the temples, well-dressed in the way that men dress when they want to appear more prosperous than they are. She had not seen him in 4 years. She did not expect that 4 years had improved him. She was not in the entrance hall when he arrived. She had made certain of that. She watched from the upper landing as he was admitted below, his hat removed, his coat taken, his hand extended to the Duke with the warm, practiced grip of a man who considered himself a trusted ally. She watched the Duke receive him with the neutral courtesy he applied to most things, and she watched her uncle's eyes move around the entrance hall with the quick, cataloging attention of a man reminding himself of what he stood to gain. Then her uncle looked up. Not at her, he didn't see her on the landing, she had stepped back far enough. He looked up at the house itself, with an expression that took Clara a moment to identify. Then she recognized it. Ownership, anticipated ownership, the look of a man mentally moving in. She went back to Lady Whitmore's sitting room and picked up her embroidery, and said nothing to anyone. She had 8 days. She moved that night. The document room was at the end of the west wing, and Clara had been past its door a dozen times without stopping. It was kept locked. She had noted the lock mechanism on her second day, the type of key it required. The slight discoloration of the wood around the keyhole that suggested it was used frequently. She had also noted on her 4th day that the housekeeper's key ring held a key that did not correspond to any door she had identified in her general movements through the house. Mrs. Drummond's key ring hung on its hook in the housekeeper's room every night from 10 o'clock onward. Mrs. Drummond slept deeply. Clara had established this through the simple means of listening. She did not take the key. She borrowed it for 11 minutes, returning it to its hook before the clock in the lower corridor had finished its progression from 10 to quarter past. What she did in those 11 minutes was move through the document room with a small candle, and the systematic precision of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and approximately where it would be. Her father had told her in the letter, in the room where the household records are kept, he had written in his careful hand, behind the panel to the left of the window, there is a space that was built into the original construction of the house. Your grandfather knew about it. I know about it. You will know about it because I am telling you now. Inside that space I have placed what needs to be there. The panel was where he had described. The space was behind it, and inside the space, wrapped in oilskin as her father had always wrapped important documents, was an envelope. Clara did not open it that night. She replaced the panel, returned the key, and went to bed with the envelope inside her traveling coat, hung on the back of the door. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Hall, to feel the edges of something that might have been relief. She opened the envelope the next morning before anyone else was awake. It contained 3 things: her father's will, signed and witnessed with meticulous legality and dated 8 months before his death, a letter from the family solicitor in London confirming the will's validity and the location of the original filing, and a brief personal note in her father's handwriting that said only, "I knew you would find it. I am sorry it came to this. The house is yours. It has always been yours." She read the note 3 times. Then she folded everything carefully back into the oilskin, placed it in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, and went downstairs to collect Lady Whitmore's breakfast tray. Mrs. Beale gave her the good tea without comment. Clara drank it standing in the kitchen, which was not what companions did, and Mrs. Beale said nothing about it, and Phelps came in from the kitchen garden with early vegetables and looked at Clara and read her face with the accuracy of a man who had known her family for 40 years, and gave a single, slow nod. Clara nodded back. The days that followed were the most delicate she had yet navigated. Her uncle was charming at dinner. She heard him from the corridor. She did not dine with the household, which was a mercy, his voice carrying the easy warmth of a man performing for an audience he believed entirely won. He was working on the Duke. She could hear it in the rhythm of the conversation, the way her uncle steered and circled, planting small seeds with the patience of someone who had been doing this for years. She began to understand the shape of his plan more fully on the 3rd day of his visit, when she overheard through the study door, which she had come to learn did not close entirely without a deliberate pull, a conversation between her uncle and the Duke. She did not intend to eavesdrop. She had been passing with a letter for Lady Whitmore. She stopped because she heard her own name. Clara Ashford, her uncle was saying in a tone of careful reluctance, as if he were sharing something that caused him personal pain. I feel it is my duty to speak plainly, Your Grace, since I understand she has been in residence here. The Duke's voice even. She arrived as a companion. She has been satisfactory. Yes. A pause. I am glad to hear it. I must tell you, and I say this as a man who has genuinely tried to assist my niece, that she has a history of certain difficulties, an instability of character. She has made claims before about property, about her circumstances, that have proven to be, let us say, not entirely grounded in reality. Silence from the Duke. I do not say this to damage her, her uncle continued with magnificent sincerity. She is my brother's daughter. I have a fondness for her. But if she has said anything to you regarding the estate, regarding any supposed documents or arrangements, she has said very little to me, the Duke said, about anything. Good. Her uncle's voice settled with satisfaction. Good. That is reassuring. I only mention it because the legal process surrounding the estate is quite settled, quite straightforward, and I would not want any confusion to arise from things she might allege. Clara stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. Then she walked on, because standing still any longer would have required her to make a decision about what she did with her hands, and she did not yet wish to make that decision. She delivered Lady Whitmore's letter. She came back through the corridor. The study door was still not entirely closed. She heard the Duke say, in a different tone, slower, more careful, "You said she has made claims before." "I'm afraid so." "What kind of claims?" A pause. Her uncle was recalibrating. About property that did not belong to her, about documents she insisted existed but that no one else had ever seen. Another silence, longer this time. "I see," said the Duke. Clara went upstairs. She sat on her bed. She placed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the window and thought about her breathing, which required more thought than usual. She had expected this. She had always known this was coming. Her uncle had been constructing this narrative for 4 years, since before her father was even dead, laying groundwork, managing perception, ensuring that any claim she made would arrive pre-discredited. She had known, and yet hearing it said in her father's house, to a man who she had observed this, she had filed it carefully, begun to see her as something other than furniture, produced in her chest a cold and specific anger that she had not fully anticipated. She breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when the footsteps came down the corridor and stopped outside her door, and the knock came firm, unhurried, the knock of a man who did not doubt he would be admitted. She opened the door. The Duke stood in the corridor. His expression was the neutral one she knew, but underneath it something had shifted, a tension she could not entirely read. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Your uncle tells me you have made claims about the estate before," he said, direct, without preamble. At least he was that. Claims that were found to be without foundation. Clara looked at him. She felt the anger in her chest, cold and precise and entirely contained. She felt it, and then she made a choice. "Did he show you my father's will?" she said. The Duke said nothing. "Not a summary of it," Clara continued, her voice even. "Not a description of it, not a copy. The original document with my father's signature and the solicitor's seal. Did he show you that?" Silence. "Your Grace," Clara said, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not heat, not desperation, but a quality of absolute steadiness that was, perhaps, more striking than either. "You are preparing to make a decision about a significant piece of property. Before you make it, I would like to ask you one question, and I would like you to answer it honestly." He waited. "In all your dealings with Gerald Ashford regarding this estate," she said, "have you ever seen the original will? Not a copy, the original." The Duke held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, not doubt, not belief, but the particular look of a man who has just realized there is a question he should have asked some time ago and did not ask it. He did not answer. He did not need to. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "That is what I thought." She began to close the door. The Duke put one hand flat against it, not forcefully, just enough to stop it. "Miss Ashford," he said. She waited. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "Be careful." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of belief. It was two words delivered in a low and level tone that communicated, with minimal efficiency, that whatever calculation he was running in his head had not resolved itself yet, but that she should not walk into any dark corridors alone. Clara looked at the hand on her door. She looked at his face. "I have been careful," she said, "for quite some time." She did not close the door again. He removed his hand and walked back down the corridor, and she watched him go, and she stood in the doorway of the narrow room that had been given to her like a servant's cell in the house that had been her mother's and her grandfather's and would be hers, and she felt the cold anger in her chest settle into something harder and quieter and more durable. That night she did not sleep until well past midnight. She lay in the dark and listened to the house around her, the old sounds of it, the breathing of stone and timber that she had known since childhood, and she thought about what came next. She thought about the envelope in her coat pocket. She thought about 8 days that were now 5. She thought about a Duke who had not answered her question and what that meant, and whether it meant what she thought it meant. And then she heard it. A sound from the end of the West Wing. Quiet, but not quiet enough. The particular sound of someone moving through a room with the careful deliberateness of someone who should not be there. The document room. Clara was out of bed before she had finished thinking. She pulled her coat on over her nightgown, picked up the candle from the nightstand, lit it with steady hands, and moved into the corridor. She walked to the end of the West Wing. The document room door was ajar, the lock disengaged, the wood pulled back from the frame by someone who knew what they were doing. Clara pushed the door open and walked in. Her uncle stood on the far side of the room, a lamp in his hand, the panel to the left of the window pulled away from the wall. He was staring at the empty space behind it. His face, when he turned and saw Clara standing in the doorway in her coat with her candle, went through several expressions in rapid succession before it settled on the one he had decided to deploy. "My dear," he said, with the warm sorrow of a man deeply pained by what he was observing, "what are you doing here at this hour? I was worried about you. I heard." "You heard nothing," Clara said. "The room is at the end of the wing. No one hears anything from here." He stopped. She looked at the empty space behind the panel. She looked at her uncle's face. "It isn't there," she said. She kept her voice perfectly, completely even. "Whatever you came to find, it isn't there anymore." Her uncle's face went very still. "I wondered when you would try," Clara said. She stood in the doorway of the document room in her father's house with her candle and her coat, and the envelope against her ribs, and she looked at the man who had spent 4 years dismantling everything her father had built, and she felt nothing that she was willing to show him. "I think," she said quietly, "that you should go to bed." She held the door open. After a long moment, her uncle walked past her and out into the corridor without a word. His lamp threw his shadow long against the wall. Clara watched him go. She waited until his footsteps had receded entirely. Then she went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and placed one hand over the envelope inside her coat and held it there in the dark. 5 days. She could do 5 days. The morning after the document room, Clara came down to breakfast and found her uncle already at the table in the housekeeper's sitting room, which was not where he took his meals, which meant he had come there deliberately, which meant the conversation she had hoped to delay by at least another day was apparently happening now. She sat down, she poured her tea, she waited. Her uncle watched her with the expression he had settled on since the previous night, not the warm sorrow, which she had refused, but something more careful. He was recalibrating again. He did it constantly, she had observed, the way a man recalibrates when the footing keeps shifting beneath him. It was the closest thing to honesty she had ever seen from him. "You have something," he said. "Good morning, Uncle Gerald," Clara said. "Don't." His voice dropped the warmth entirely. This, she thought, was the real voice. She had heard it once before when she was 17, when he had told her father that his management of the estate was an embarrassment and that the family would be better served by someone with genuine capability. Her father had said nothing. Clara had stood in the hall outside the study and memorized the sound of it. "You have something. I want to know what." "I have my tea," Clara said pleasantly, "which is very good this morning. Mrs. Beale has quite a gift." Her uncle set down his cup. "You were a difficult child," he said. "I remember it clearly. Your father indulged it because he found it charming. I did not find it charming." "I know," Clara said. "I remember that clearly as well." They looked at each other across the table with the particular honesty of two people who have decided, mutually and without announcement, to stop performing. "Whatever you think you have," her uncle said, "it will not hold. I have spent 4 years ensuring that any claim you make arrives already discredited. I have spoken to the right people. I have managed the legal process with considerable care. You are a young woman of no particular standing, with a history of instability, which I have taken pains to establish, and whatever document you believe exists, I will have it questioned, challenged, and set aside before you can place it in front of a magistrate." Clara drank her tea. She set the cup down. She looked at her uncle for a moment. "4 years," she said. "I beg your pardon. You said you spent 4 years on this." She tilted her head slightly. "My father was ill for 2 years before he died. You began before he was gone." Her uncle said nothing. "I know," Clara said, not with heat, simply as a statement of fact, the way one states facts that have been known for some time and require no further discussion. "I have known for quite a while. I want you to understand that clearly, not so that you feel caught, but so that you do not waste either of our time pretending otherwise." She stood, she smoothed her skirt. She picked up her cup and her saucer. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said. "I believe you are expected in the Duke's study at 10 o'clock. I would use the time between now and then to think carefully about what you intend to say." She left him at the table. She spent the morning with Lady Whitmore, who was in better spirits than usual and talked at length about a ball she had attended in her youth, where the champagne had been unexpectedly excellent. Clara listened and responded and performed her function with steady attention, and underneath her steady attention, she was calculating with the focused precision of someone who has 4 days and knows it. The document she carried was legitimate. She had no doubt of that. Her father had been meticulous, had been, in fact, the kind of man who understood that meticulous documentation was the only reliable protection against men like his brother, and had arranged his affairs accordingly. The will was properly executed, properly witnessed, properly filed with the solicitor in London. The copy in the oilskin envelope was the original. She was certain of this. What she was less certain of was time. Her uncle had said 4 years. He had managed people, managed perception, managed the legal landscape with what he himself described as considerable care. He was not wrong that her claim would be challenged. It would be challenged immediately and aggressively, and by men who had been prepared for exactly this moment. The process could take weeks, months. And the condition of her father's will, that she must claim the estate in person before a legal witness, within 1 year of his death, expired in 4 days. 4 days. She needed a solicitor, or a magistrate, or someone with the legal authority to receive her claim and record it formally before the deadline. She needed this in 4 days. and she needed it without her uncle knowing it was happening until it had already happened. She was working through the logistics of this. She had been working through the logistics of this since the previous night, in the dark, with her hand over the envelope, when the knock came at Lady Whitmore's sitting room door. It was one of the footmen. He addressed himself to Clara, not to Lady Whitmore, which was irregular. His Grace would like to see Miss Ashford in the library, he said, at her convenience. Lady Whitmore looked at Clara with mild curiosity. Clara thanked the footman, excused herself, and walked to the library. The Duke was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard the door. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept particularly well, which she found she could not entirely blame him for, given the circumstances. He said without preamble, "Sit down." Clara sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was intentional, the positioning of a man who wanted to maintain some sense of control over a situation he was increasingly aware he did not fully understand. She said nothing. She had learned over the course of her time at Whitmore Hall that the Duke's silences were working silences. He was not a man who left spaces empty out of carelessness. He was thinking. She let him think. "Your uncle came to see me this morning," he said finally. "I expected he would." The Duke looked at her. "He told me that you are," his word was unstable, "that you have a history of making claims that cannot be substantiated, that any document you might produce regarding the estate should be viewed with significant skepticism." "Yes," Clara said, "he would say that. He has been building that case for 4 years." "That is a very specific number." "It is a very specific case." The Duke moved away from the window. He came and stood near the chair across from her, but did not sit. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen several times now, the one she could not entirely categorize, the one that sat beneath his usual neutrality like something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "He also told me," the Duke said more slowly, "that you were present in the document room last night." "We were both present in the document room last night," Clara said. "He arrived first." A pause. "What was he looking for?" "The same thing I found 3 days ago," Clara said. The silence that followed this was different from the working silences she had catalogued. It was the silence of a man absorbing a piece of information that has reorganized several other pieces of information around it. "You found something," the Duke said. "Yes." 3 days ago." "Yes." He looked at her, and you said nothing. Clara met his gaze. "I was waiting," she said, "to understand what kind of man you were." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And have you?" It was, she thought, a genuine question, not defensive, not rhetorical. He asked it the way a man asks when he actually wants to know the answer. Clara looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the careful control of his expression and the way he was standing, close enough to be direct, far enough to give her space, which she had observed was actually characteristic of him, that particular spatial courtesy that she doubted he was aware he extended. She thought about the drawing room and Lord Hensley. She thought about the corridor outside her room and the 2 words he had said. She thought about the fact that she had been in this house for nearly 2 weeks and had observed him daily, and had not yet seen him be cruel. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a man who makes assumptions quickly and revises them slowly. I think you were handed a situation you did not create and have been managing it with the information available to you, which has been deliberately incomplete. I think you are not your uncle's instrument, which was not something I was certain of when I arrived." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "That is not entirely a compliment," he said. "No," Clara agreed, "but it is what I think." He sat down then in the chair across from her, and leaned forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, which was not a ducal posture but was, she thought, an honest one. "Show me," he said. Clara reached into the inner pocket of her dress. She had moved the envelope that morning closer, where it had been all day against the warmth of her, and placed it on the table between them. The Duke looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he understands will change things, and is taking one last moment before the change. Then he picked it up. He opened it carefully. He read. Clara watched his face. He read slowly, which she appreciated. It meant he was actually reading, not skimming for the parts that confirmed what he already thought. He read the will first, all the way through, his expression controlled but not entirely neutral. She saw the precise moment he reached the ownership clause because something in the line of his jaw shifted. He read the solicitor's letter. He read her father's note last. He was quiet for a long time when he finished. Then he set the documents down on the table with the particular care of someone handling something that matters, and he looked at Clara and he said, "Why didn't you simply tell me?" It was the question she had known was coming. She had prepared an answer for it, a measured, reasonable answer that explained her strategy without revealing more than was necessary. She did not give that answer. "Because I needed to know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she had intended. "What you would do with the power to destroy me before I handed it to you." The Duke said nothing. "My uncle has spent 4 years making certain that my word alone is worth nothing," Clara continued. "If I had arrived at Whitmore Hall and announced myself and shown you this document on the first day, you would have had 2 choices, believe me or believe him. And you had no reason to believe me. None at all. So I watched. I waited. I needed to know whether you were the kind of man who would use what I gave you against me." She paused. "I have known men who would." The Duke was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the neutrality, not the assessing calculation. Something that had less protection in it than anything she had observed from him. "The boots," he said. His voice was different. "The boots," Clara agreed. He stood abruptly. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the set of his back and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who is working very hard on something inside himself. "The deadline," he said. "When?" "4 days," Clara said. He turned around. "I need to go to London." "I know." "Tonight?" "Yes." He looked at her across the library, her father's library, the room where she had learned to read, where the books on the 3rd shelf from the bottom had been placed at child height deliberately, where the faded mark on the windowsill was from a pot of ink she had knocked over at age 9, and which had apparently resisted 30 years of housekeeping. "The will is legitimate," he said. "I am not questioning it." "I know you're not," Clara said. "Your uncle will challenge it regardless." "Yes." "And he stopped. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. "There may be complications. My position in this, the legal entanglement, I need to speak to my own solicitor before I can tell you with certainty what I can do." Clara looked at him. "I am not asking you to do anything, Your Grace." He frowned. "You should be." The words landed in the room between them with a weight that neither of them addressed directly. Clara looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I have the document," she said. "I have 4 days. I have a solicitor in London who knows my name and my father's wishes and has been waiting for exactly this moment. What I do not have is time to get there and file the claim and return before my uncle understands what is happening and moves to intercept it." She paused. "What I need is—" "A witness," the Duke said. "You need a legal witness present when you file, or your uncle will claim the filing was improperly executed." "Yes." "Someone whose testimony cannot be easily discredited." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, with the tone of a man stating a logistical fact rather than making any kind of declaration, "I am a Duke. My testimony is not easily discredited." Clara said nothing. "I will ride tonight," he said. "You will come with me. We will be in London by morning and at your solicitor's office before noon. The claim will be filed before your uncle knows we have left." He picked up the documents from the table and held them out to her. "Keep these on your person." Clara took them. She looked at them in her hands. She looked at him. "Why?" she said, not suspiciously, genuinely. She wanted to know. He seemed briefly thrown by the question. He recovered. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. Then, as if the admission cost him something, "and because I handed you a pair of boots." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "The laces on my left boot are loose," she said. The Duke blinked. "I'm joking," Clara said. She stood, placed the documents carefully back inside her dress and smoothed her skirt. "I will be ready in an hour." She walked to the library door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her. "My father's note," she said. "The one at the bottom of the envelope. I would like it back when this is finished." "Of course," he said. She nodded. She left. In the corridor outside, she walked 6 steps, stopped, placed one hand flat against the wall of her father's house and breathed. Then she straightened and went upstairs to pack. They left at 10 o'clock at night. Clara came down to the rear entrance with her traveling coat and her small trunk and the envelope against her ribs, and found the Duke already there with 2 horses and no carriage, which she had not expected. He looked at her small trunk and then at the horses and said, with the brevity of a man who had made a decision and was not revisiting it, "We'll make better time. Can you ride?" "I grew up on this estate," Clara said. He accepted this without comment and helped her mount with the impersonal efficiency of a man performing a practical function, and they rode out through the rear gate and down the back lane that ran along the eastern edge of the property, away from the main drive where anyone watching from the house might see them go. Clara had ridden this lane as a child. In the dark, with the smell of the fields around her and the sound of hooves on packed earth, she felt the particular disorientation of a place known in daylight appearing entirely different at night, familiar in structure, strange in feeling, like a face seen in the wrong light. They did not speak much for the first hour. The Duke rode slightly ahead, which was natural on a narrow lane, and Clara watched the set of his back and thought about the library and what he had said and what it meant, and arrived at no particular conclusion except that she would know more when this was over. At some point past midnight, they stopped at a coaching inn to rest the horses. The Duke procured tea and bread without being asked, and they sat across a rough table in the empty front room and ate in silence, and Clara thought, 3 days. "Your uncle will know by morning," the Duke said. He was looking at the table, not at her. "Yes. He'll move quickly." "He always moves quickly. It's his best quality." She drank her tea. "He will go to the Duke's study first, your study, and find you gone. Then he will go to Mrs. Drummond and ask where I am. Mrs. Drummond will tell him I left with you because she is honest and because my uncle will press her and she has no reason to protect me." "She might," the Duke said, in a tone that suggested he knew his housekeeper rather better than his housekeeper suspected. "She might," Clara allowed, "but my uncle will assume London regardless. He'll send a rider." "He won't get there before us." "No, but he will be behind us when we arrive, which means the filing must be completed before noon or the advantage disappears." She set down her cup. "Do you understand the urgency of noon?" "I understood the urgency of noon before we left," the Duke said, with a dryness that surprised her into almost smiling. They reached London in the grey early morning, the city materializing out of the mist in the way it always did. Gradually, then suddenly, the fields giving way to roads, giving way to buildings, giving way to the dense particular noise and smell of the city that Clara had always found both exhausting and alive. She had lived in London for 2 years after leaving Whitmore Hall, in a set of rented rooms near Bloomsbury, working as a governess while she saved and planned and waited for the conditions to be right. She knew the city well. She knew Mr. Partridge's offices on Carey Street well. She had sat across from that small, careful man twice before, had placed in his hands her father's letter and her own account of events, and had watched him listen with the grave attentiveness of a solicitor who takes the measure of a case slowly and thoroughly before committing to it. He had committed. He had told her, "When you are ready, come to me. I will be here." She had written to him 3 days ago. She had not received a reply, which meant either the letter had not yet reached him or he had not been able to respond in time, and there was no way to know which until they arrived. They arrived at 8:30. Mr. Partridge was there. He opened the door himself, which was not something he generally did, and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who had been waiting and was relieved that his waiting was not indefinite. And then he looked at the Duke behind her with an expression that was harder to read, but involved a rapid recalibration of several expectations. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Mr. Partridge," Clara said, "this is the Duke of Whitmore. He is here as a witness." Mr. Partridge looked at the Duke for another moment. Then he stood back from the door and said, "Come in." What followed was 2 hours of the most careful, deliberate, painstaking legal work Clara had ever witnessed. Mr. Partridge was not a fast man. He was a thorough man, which was better. He read every document twice. He asked questions of Clara that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, about dates and witnesses and the circumstances of her father's final months, and Clara answered all of them with the accuracy of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. The Duke sat in the corner of the room and said nothing unless addressed, and when addressed answered with the directness of a man who understood that the weight of his presence in the room was doing its work without embellishment. At one point, Mr. Partridge looked at him over the top of his spectacles and said, "You are prepared to provide a signed statement that you were present for the presentation and examination of this document, and that you observed no irregularity in its execution?" "I am," the Duke said. "And you are prepared to stand behind that statement if it is challenged in court?" "Mr. Partridge," the Duke said, with a patience that had a very slight edge beneath it, "I have ridden through the night to sit in this room. I am prepared." Mr. Partridge accepted this with a small nod and returned to his documents. At 11:47 in the morning, Clara signed her name to the formal claim. Mr. Partridge signed below it. The Duke signed as witness. Mr. Partridge pressed his seal into the wax with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of the moment, and then he set down the seal and looked at Clara and said, quietly, "It is done, Miss Ashford. The claim is properly filed. The estate is yours." Clara looked at the document on the desk, at her name on it and her father's name above it, and the seal that made it real in the way that the will in her pocket had always been real, but had never quite felt until this moment. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Partridge." Her voice was steady. It was, she would later reflect, a considerable achievement. They were back outside on Carey Street at noon exactly, and Clara stood on the pavement in the gray London morning and breathed the city air and felt something shift in her chest that she could not entirely name, not triumph, not relief, something older and quieter than either. Something that had to do with her father and her mother and the south garden, and a portrait covered with a cloth in the east corridor. The Duke stood beside her. He was looking at the street with the expression of a man who has completed a task and is now assessing what comes next. "It will still be challenged," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "My uncle will file a counterclaim within the week. There will be proceedings. It will take time. But the deadline is met. The deadline is met." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with some effort as if the words required assembly, "I owe you more than an apology for the boots." Clara looked at him. In the morning light, away from the house, away from the formal structure of household and title, and the particular performance that Whitmore Hall required of both of them, he looked. She found this unexpected tired. Not weak. Just a man who had ridden through the night and was standing on a London pavement with the residue of a sleepless night on him, and who had said something honest. "You owe me nothing," she said. He turned to look at her. "That's not." "You owe me nothing," she repeated more gently. "You came when I needed you to come. You signed what needed to be signed. That is," she stopped. She began again. "That is more than I had any right to expect." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she did not examine too closely, because she was tired, and the moment was already sufficiently weighted without additional complication. "We should eat," he said finally, "before we ride back." "Yes," Clara said. They found a quiet place near the Strand and ate a proper meal for the first time since the previous day, and they talked, not about the estate or the documents or Gerald Ashford or anything that mattered in the legal sense. They talked about small things, about London, about the city in the morning versus the city at night. Clara mentioned the bookshops near Bloomsbury, and the Duke said he had not been to a bookshop in 2 years, which she told him was a significant personal failing, and he looked briefly startled by this, and then, unexpectedly, for the first time in her observing of him, he almost smiled. It was, she thought, a very good almost smile. She filed it away without comment. They rode back to Whitmore Hall in the afternoon, arriving as the early evening light was coming through the elm trees, golden and long across the drive. Clara was tired in a way that went past the body into something deeper, the tiredness of sustained effort finally permitted to ease. She was thinking of her room, of the narrow bed, of sleeping for perhaps 12 uninterrupted hours, when they came through the front door and found Mrs. Drummond in the entrance hall with an expression that stopped Clara entirely. "Your Grace," Mrs. Drummond said, and then carefully to Clara, "Miss Ashford." The way she said it was wrong, something in it. "What has happened?" the Duke said. Mrs. Drummond looked between them. "Mr. Ashford," she said. Before he left this morning, he spoke to Lady Whitmore, at some length." A pause. "Lady Whitmore has been," she stopped. She seemed to be choosing words. "She has been given to understand certain things about Miss Ashford's character and intentions." Clara went very still. "She has requested," Mrs. Drummond continued, with the stiffness of someone delivering a message they personally object to, "that Miss Ashford's employment be terminated, and that she leave the premises before dinner." The entrance hall was very quiet. Clara looked at Mrs. Drummond. She looked at the floor of the entrance hall, the same stone floor it had always been, the same pattern, the same faint mark near the left wall where a heavy piece of furniture had once stood for years and left its impression in the stone. She looked at the Duke. His face was controlled. It was the controlled face she had catalogued in the early days, the neutral, unreadable face. But underneath it something was happening that the neutrality was working very hard to contain. He said nothing. He did not say, "She is not a companion, she is the owner of this house." He did not say, "We have just filed a legal claim that makes this conversation meaningless." He did not say any of the things that would have resolved the moment in 30 seconds. He said nothing. And Clara understood, in the way that one understands things that arrive whole and complete and without warning, that his mother's wishes sat on him with a weight she had not fully accounted for, that whatever had been said to Lady Whitmore this morning had arrived in fertile ground, that the man who had ridden through the night and signed his name beside hers and almost smiled over breakfast was now standing in his entrance hall between his mother's instruction and his own conscience, and he had not yet decided which way to move. The silence stretched. Clara made the decision for him. "Thank you, Mrs. Drummond," she said. Her voice was even. She was very good at even. "I will pack my things." "Miss Ashford," the Duke said. "It's quite all right," Clara said. She did not look at him. "I'll be no more than an hour." She walked past Mrs. Drummond. She walked up the stairs. She walked down the corridor to her small room and closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of it with her traveling coat still on and the envelope still against her ribs and the smell of the journey still on her, and she allowed herself 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Then she opened her trunk and began to fold things into it. She was methodical. She was always methodical. She folded each item with the neat precision of someone who has packed quickly in difficult circumstances before and understands that the hands must be occupied when the mind cannot afford to be. She had nearly finished when she saw the roses on the windowsill, the ones from Phelps, the ones she had been refreshing from the garden every few days. They were past their best now, the petals beginning to drop. She looked at them for a moment. She left them where they were. She closed the trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed and took out a sheet of paper and a pen from the small case she traveled with, and she wrote. She wrote for several minutes in the careful, unhurried hand her father had taught her. When she finished, she folded the letter, did not seal it, and placed it on the desk. Then she picked up her trunk, and she walked out of the room, and she did not look back at it. She carried the trunk downstairs herself. Mrs. Drummond was in the entrance hall and made a movement to assist her, which Clara declined with a smile. The cook, Mrs. Beale, appeared from the kitchen corridor, and her face, when she saw the trunk, did something complicated and painful. Clara looked at her and shook her head very slightly, the same small message she had given Phelps on the second morning. "Not yet, but it's coming." She asked the footman to arrange for a carriage. She stood in the entrance hall and waited. She did not look at the east corridor where the portrait was. She looked at the front door. The Duke appeared on the stairs. He came down them with the look of a man who has reached a decision and is not entirely comfortable with it and is coming to deliver it anyway. Clara watched him descend and thought, there it is. This is the shape of it. She had wondered, she realized, since nearly the beginning. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had been disciplined about it, but she had wondered. He reached the bottom of the stairs. He stopped. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. "Please don't," Clara said. He closed it. "Whatever you are about to say," she said quietly, "I would prefer you didn't. I am tired and I have the document and the claim is filed and I will be perfectly fine." She paused. "I always have been." He looked at her with an expression she could not read and did not have the energy to try to read, and said nothing, and she picked up her trunk and walked out the front door of Whitmore Hall into the evening air. The carriage came. She got into it. She did not look back at the house as they drove away down the elm-lined approach. She looked straight ahead. She held the envelope against her ribs with one hand, and with the other she held the edge of the seat, and she watched the road ahead, and she breathed. On the desk in her room at Whitmore Hall, the letter she had written sat open and unread. She did not know when he would find it. She did not know what he would do when he did. She was very tired. She had been patient for a very long time. She had done everything correctly, and the house was hers on paper, and in law, and tomorrow it would begin to be hers in fact. And none of that changed the particular quality of the hollow feeling in her chest as the carriage moved away through the elm trees, and the last of the evening light came down gold and long across the Whitmore fields. She had not let herself want this, she realized. She had planned and calculated and positioned herself with meticulous care, and she had not, in all of it, permitted herself to want this. Not the house, not the legal victory, not the vindication. This. She put the thought away. She was good at putting things away. She watched the road ahead and did not think about the expression on his face at the bottom of the stairs. And the carriage carried her away from Whitmore Hall in the gathering dark. And inside the house she had left behind, on the desk in the small room overlooking the south garden, a letter sat waiting to be found. The letter said, "Your Grace asterisk. I have left the document room key with Mrs. Drummond. I borrowed it twice. She may not have noticed, but I thought you should know. The roses along the south wall want cutting back before autumn. Phelps knows how my mother preferred it done, if anyone wishes to ask him. The portrait in the east corridor is my mother. Her name was Anne Ashford, née Cavendish. She was 23 when it was painted, and she is wearing the blue dress because my father asked her to, and she never could refuse him anything he asked gently. I would like it uncovered when the house is mine again. I would like it to stay in the east corridor, where the afternoon light reaches it. I do not write this to make you feel anything in particular. I write it because these things should be known by whoever lives in this house, and you have lived in it, and perhaps you will remember. Thank you for London. I mean that without qualification. Clara Ashford. The Duke read it standing at the desk in the small room overlooking the south garden. He had come looking for her 40 minutes after she left, had stood in the entrance hall for 20 of those minutes saying nothing to anyone, and then had gone upstairs with the particular set of a man who has decided something and is moving before the decision can be revisited. The room smelled faintly of roses. He read the letter twice. He stood at the window and looked at the south garden in the dark. At the wall he could barely see where the roses were, and he thought about a woman who had arrived in this house with a trunk and a gray dress and no jewelry except a ring turned stone inward, and had cleaned his boots and said nothing and waited, with a patience he was only now fully understanding the depth of, for the truth to have room to exist. He thought about what he had done at the bottom of the stairs. He had done nothing. He had stood there and let her walk out the door with her trunk and her dignity and the envelope against her ribs, and he had said nothing, and he had watched her go, and he had told himself that the legal matter was settled, that she was protected, that his mother's distress was real and required managing, that the situation needed time, that there were reasons, good and practical and legitimate reasons, for the silence. He had been, he understood now, standing at the desk with the letter in his hand, a coward. Not in London, not on the road through the night or in Partridge's office or at any point during the preceding days when the situation had required action, which he had taken without hesitation because it was clear and practical and had a correct answer he could execute. Here, at the bottom of these stairs. In the moment that had not been clear or practical, and had not had a correct answer that could be executed, only a choice between his mother's expectations and the expression on Clara Ashford's face. That expression he had never managed to fully categorize, the one that was composed and certain, and underneath, the composure was something else, something he had been working very hard not to name too precisely, because naming it precisely would have required him to do something about it. He folded the letter, he put it in his coat pocket, he left the room. He went downstairs and found his mother in the sitting room with her embroidery and her nerves, and the particular quality of self-righteousness that settled on her when she felt she had managed a situation correctly. She looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman expecting to be agreed with. "James," she said, "I think it was for the best. Your uncle, Gerald Ashford," he explained her history quite clearly, "and I really do think—" "Gerald Ashford is not my uncle," the Duke said. "He is the man who has been illegally managing an estate that does not belong to him for 4 years while his niece prepared to reclaim it. He came to this house to prevent that from happening, and he used you to do it." Lady Whitmore stared at him. "He told you she was unstable," the Duke said. "He told you she made claims that couldn't be substantiated. He told you she was a problem to be managed." He looked at his mother steadily. "Every word of that was a construction. It has been a construction for 4 years. And I sat in a solicitor's office this morning and watched Clara Ashford place a legally executed will in front of a man who has been waiting for it, and she owns this house, Mother. She has always owned this house. And we have been living in it." The silence in the room was considerable. Lady Whitmore set down her embroidery. She had the look of a woman doing rapid and uncomfortable revision, the kind that required setting aside a number of opinions she had held with some confidence. To her credit, she did not protest immediately. She sat with it. She looked at her hands. "She never said a word," Lady Whitmore said finally, not defensively, almost with wonder. "No," the Duke said, "she didn't." His mother was quiet for another moment. Then, with the careful tone of a woman reassessing, "She was very good with my nerves." "I know." She listened. Most people don't listen. Lady Whitmore picked up her embroidery again, then set it down again. "Where is she now?" "I don't know," the Duke said. "That is what I am about to address." He left his mother's sitting room and went to find Mrs. Drummond. Mrs. Drummond, when presented with the Duke's direct inquiry about Clara's destination, did not dissemble. She was not a woman who dissembled. She said that Miss Ashford had asked for a carriage to the coaching inn at Barton Cross, and that from there she had presumably intended to travel toward London, and that she had left approximately 3 hours ago. 3 hours. The Duke said, "Have Pemberton saddled and went to change his coat." He was in the stable yard 12 minutes later when Phelps appeared from the kitchen garden side. The old man looked at the Duke with an expression of absolute neutral assessment that reminded the Duke, with sudden and clarifying force, of Clara's own face. "The coaching inn at Barton Cross," the Duke said. "She left 3 hours ago. How long does the last coach to London wait?" "Depends on the day," Phelps said. "Tuesdays they wait longer. Stage is usually late." "It's Tuesday," the Duke said. "Yes, it is," said Phelps. The Duke mounted. He looked down at Phelps. "The roses along the south wall," he said. "She wants them cut back before autumn, her mother's way." Phelps looked up at him. Something shifted in the old man's face, not surprise, but the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is watching the patience begin to pay. "I know how," Phelps said. "I've been waiting to be asked." The Duke nodded. He rode. He rode hard. The road to Barton Cross was 4 miles, and he covered it in the dark with the particular focused urgency of a man who has identified exactly what he should have done 2 hours ago and is correcting the error with all available speed. The night was clear, which helped. The road was dry, which helped. The knowledge of what he intended to say when he arrived was less clear, which did not help, but which he set aside on the grounds that some things could not be prepared for, only arrived at. The coaching inn at Barton Cross was lit from within, warm against the dark, and the stage was still there. He could see it in the yard, horses not yet changed, the coachman arguing with a man about luggage. He pulled up in the yard and dismounted and went inside. The front room was low-ceilinged and warm and smelled of coal smoke and old wood, and the particular smell of public rooms in coaching inns that had been receiving travelers for 100 years. There were perhaps a dozen people in it. He scanned the room with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly who he was looking for. She was in the far corner. She had a cup of something in front of her. Tea, probably. She was always drinking tea, and her traveling coat on and her small trunk beside her chair. She was not reading. She was sitting with the stillness she always had, looking at nothing in particular, and she had not yet seen him. He crossed the room. She looked up when he was 3 feet away, and her face, her composed, guarded, patient face, did something it had not done in all the time he had observed it. It came apart slightly. Just slightly. The composure was there, and then it wasn't entirely, and what was underneath it for one unguarded moment was something he felt in his chest with an accuracy that left no room for uncertainty. She recovered, of course she did. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was even. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was not particularly ducal, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table, which was also not particularly ducal, and looked at her directly because he had ridden 4 miles in the dark specifically to look at her directly, and he was not going to waste it. "I stood at the bottom of the stairs," he said, "and I said nothing." Clara said nothing. "That was wrong," he said. "Not legally, the claim is filed. You are protected, that part is resolved. But it was wrong. You walked out of your own house carrying your own trunk, and I stood there and watched you go, and I had reasons for it they seemed like reasons at the time, and they were not. They were the habits of a man who is accustomed to managing things from a distance and calling it prudence." Clara looked at him with the expression he could not categorize. He was beginning to think he would never fully categorize it, and was making his peace with that. "Your mother," she began. "My mother knows," he said. "I told her everything. She is revising her opinions. She has good instincts when someone is not actively manipulating them, and she feels, I think, that she was made a fool of, which she will not forgive Gerald Ashford for easily." He paused. "She also said you were very good with her nerves." Something moved at the corner of Clara's mouth. "The legal proceedings will begin next week," he continued. "Your uncle will file a counterclaim. Mr. Partridge says 6 to 8 weeks for the formal resolution. During that time, the estate remains in a complicated position legally." He held her gaze. "I would like you to come back to Whitmore Hall, not as a companion, not as staff, as its owner while the proceedings resolve." Clara looked at him. "Your mother would like to apologize to you," he said, "in her own time and in her own way, which will involve several indirect conversations before she arrives at the apology directly, but she will get there." A pause. "You know her well," Clara said. "She is my mother," he said. "I have had 34 years." Clara looked at the table. She looked at her tea. She looked at the trunk beside her chair and at the room around her, and then she looked back at him, and he looked at her, and the coaching inn moved around them with its noise and warmth and indifference. "There is something else," he said. She waited. He reached into his coat and produced a document, not the will, not the solicitor's letter. Smaller, older, a letter, the paper slightly yellowed, the handwriting faded but legible. "I found this in my father's papers," he said. "When I inherited, I read it and I didn't understand it at the time and I filed it away." He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. "I understand it now." Clara looked at it. She reached out and picked it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top was not. "Dear Edward," it began. Edward had been his father's name, and Clara read it with the stillness she brought to everything. And the Duke watched her face as she read, and saw the moment she understood what it was. Her father had written to his father. Years ago, before the illness, before any of it, a letter between two men who had known each other, who had been neighbors and occasional friends, who had trusted each other in the quiet way that men of that generation trusted without declaration. The letter asked one thing. "If anything should happen to me," her father had written, "and Clara is alone, watch for her if you can. She is more capable than anyone will give her credit for, and she will not ask for help, and she will need someone to see past the not asking." Clara read it to the end. She held it for a moment. She set it down carefully on the table between them. She looked at him. He looked at her. The letter lay between them with the weight of two men who had known something their children had not, and the particular gravity of things that have been true for a long time before anyone says them aloud. "He knew your father," Clara said. "Apparently better than either of us knew," the Duke said. A silence. Then, "You said in the library, you said you needed to know what kind of man I was before you handed me the power to destroy you." "Yes," Clara said. "And do you know?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the coaching inn, the stage coachman was calling the final boarding. Nobody at their table moved. "I think," Clara said slowly, "that you are a man who rides 4 miles in the dark to a coaching inn on a Tuesday because he stood at the bottom of a staircase and said nothing, and couldn't let it be the last thing." The Duke held her gaze. "That is a very specific observation." "I'm a very observant person," Clara said. The coachman called again. The stage would leave without her. Clara looked at the trunk beside her chair. She looked at the door. She looked at the man across the table who had ridden through one night for a legal document and through another night for a different reason entirely, and who was looking at her now with the expression she had never been able to categorize and had stopped trying to, because some things did not need categories. "The portrait," she said, "in the East Corridor." "It will be uncovered before you return," he said, "tonight." Clara looked at him. Then she reached out and picked up her father's letter from the table and held it for a moment and placed it carefully inside her coat. "I'll need a moment to tell the coachman," she said. "Take whatever time you need," the Duke said. She stood. She went to the door and spoke briefly to the coachman. She came back. She picked up her trunk. She looked at the Duke, who had also stood and who was looking at her with the expression she decided, finally, to name it. She had earned the right. He was looking at her the way her father had looked at her mother in the portrait. The way a man looks when he has stopped pretending he doesn't. "Well then," Clara said. "Well then," said the Duke. They walked out of the coaching inn together into the clear Tuesday night, and above them the sky was enormous and full of stars, and the road back to Whitmore Hall stretched ahead of them pale and certain in the dark. He helped her mount. His hands were steady, so were hers. They rode. 1 year later, Whitmore Hall in summer was a particular kind of beautiful. Clara had always known this, had carried it with her through 2 years of rented rooms in London and 1 winter in a house that smelled of other people's lives. But knowing a thing and standing inside it were different. And she had learned, in the year since she had ridden back through the elm trees on a Tuesday night with stars overhead, to let herself stand inside it without the old guardedness, without the habit of holding good things at a slight distance in case they proved temporary. They had not proved temporary. The legal proceedings had taken 9 weeks, not 6, because Gerald Ashford had filed his counterclaim with the aggressive thoroughness of a man with nothing left to lose and a great deal to pay for. He had challenged the will's execution, the witness signatures, the filing date, the condition clause, and at one point, with the creative desperation of a cornered man, the soundness of the original notary's eyesight. Mr. Partridge had addressed each challenge with the unhurried precision of a man who had been preparing for exactly this opposition for considerably longer than Gerald Ashford had been preparing to mount it. The Duke's signed testimony had been, as he had predicted in the solicitor's office on Carey Street, not easily discredited. The estate was formally returned to Clara Ashford on a Wednesday morning in late October. Mr. Partridge had sent a letter. Clara had read it at the breakfast table, the proper breakfast table, in the dining room, where she had been taking her meals since the morning after her return, and had set it down and looked at the window and said nothing for a moment. Lady Whitmore, who was sitting across from her, and had developed the habit of joining Clara for breakfast on the grounds that it settled her nerves better than anything else she had tried, looked at her face and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," Clara said. Lady Whitmore had reached across the table and patted her hand with the warm efficiency of a woman who had completed her revision and arrived, several weeks prior, at a genuine and uncomplicated fondness. The apology had come, as the Duke had predicted, through several indirect conversations before landing directly. It had involved a lengthy discussion of a ball in 1802, a meditation on the untrustworthiness of men who smiled too readily, and then finally, one morning over tea, a quiet and straightforward, "I am sorry, my dear. I was made a fool of and you paid for it. That was wrong." Clara had accepted it without theater, and they had both been relieved to move on. Gerald Ashford had left the county before the proceedings concluded. No one had seen him since. His name was not spoken at Whitmore Hall, which was not a rule anyone had stated and everyone observed without discussion. The proceedings had also, it emerged during the 9th week, uncovered irregularities in his management of the estate finances over the preceding 4 years, irregularities that Mr. Partridge had referred quietly to the appropriate parties and which were now someone else's problem to resolve. Clara had been informed of this. She had noted it and moved forward, which was what she did with most things. What she had not moved forward from, what she had, in fact, moved steadily and deliberately toward, at the pace that both of them seemed to require, neither rushing nor retreating, was the Duke. James. She had started thinking of him as James sometime around the 3rd week after her return. She had not told him this. He had started calling her Clara, not Miss Ashford Clara, sometime around the same period. Neither of them had remarked upon the transition, which she thought was characteristic of both of them and probably efficient. They had talked. This was, she had discovered, the central fact of it, not the legal proceedings, not the social arithmetic of their respective positions, not the opinion of the county, which had been surprised, and then rapidly accepting in the way that counties were when a duke made his intentions clear. They had talked at length over many evenings, in the library and the south garden, and occasionally on horseback along the eastern boundary, where the fields ran long and flat, and the conversation had room to breathe. He had told her about the continent, about the engagement that had ended Fiona Graves, who had not waited and whom he did not blame, he said, though it had taken him some time to arrive at not blaming her. About the quietness that had come back with him, which his mother had found worrying, and which he described as a recalibration, the sense of a man who had returned to a life that fit him differently than it had before he left. Clara had told him about London, about the rented rooms and the governessing and the particular discipline of 2 years spent preparing for something without knowing exactly when it would become possible. About her father, the real man, not the legal abstraction, who had been gentle and meticulous, and had loved the south garden in the early morning, and had taught her that patience was not the same thing as passivity, that waiting with intention was its own kind of action. She had told him about the letter, what it had meant, finding it in the panel, the 30 seconds she had allowed herself in the narrow room before she stood up and went back to work. He had listened, which she had already known he could do, but there was a difference between observing that a man could listen and having him listen to you, and the difference had mattered. He had asked her, one evening in the library in November, with the directness that she had come to understand was his form of gentleness, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He had not said, "You own the house and I have become inconveniently attached to you, and this is the logical resolution." He had said, "I have been trying to imagine the library without you in it for the past several weeks, and I find I cannot do it, which I suspect means something, and I would rather know what you think it means than spend another winter being sensible about it." Clara had looked at him across the library, her father's library, their library, the room where she had learned to read, and where the books on the third shelf from the bottom had been placed at child height and were still there, and had thought about 17 rooms and 4 gardens, and one man who had handed her a pair of muddy boots and looked straight past her, and one man sitting across from her now who had not looked past her since approximately the 4th day. She had said yes, not with ceremony, just yes, the way she said things she meant. Now it was summer, a year from her arrival, and Whitmore Hall was full of light. The portrait of her mother hung uncovered in the east corridor, as it had since the night Clara returned from the coaching inn. The afternoon light reached it at 4 o'clock and turned the blue dress in the painting warm and particular, and Clara stopped to look at it most days as she passed. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she said things she didn't say aloud to anyone else. Her mother had been 23 in the portrait, younger than Clara was now, and she was wearing the blue dress because Clara's father had asked gently, and she had never been able to refuse him. Clara understood this now in a way she hadn't entirely before. The South Garden roses had been cut back properly in autumn, the way Phelps knew from long practice and long memory, and they had come back in June with the unreasonable abundance of things that have been properly tended after years of being merely maintained. Clara had stood at the window the morning she first saw them fully in bloom and felt something complete itself that had been incomplete for a long time. Phelps still tipped his hat to her when she crossed the rear courtyard. He still did it with the particular gravity of a man paying a specific kind of respect, the kind he had been withholding for years and was now able to give freely. Clara still gave him the small nod of acknowledgement she had given him on the second morning. It had become, between them, a private language, a shorthand for everything that had been understood without being said. Mrs. Beale still gave her the good tea. This had simply become the order of things. Mrs. Drummond remained professionally neutral and absolutely reliable, and had accepted the changes in the household with the equanimity of a woman who had suspected for some time that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, and was not surprised to have been proven correct. Lady Cecily Aldworth had married a baron in the north of England sometime in the spring. Lady Whitmore had mentioned it over breakfast with the careful neutrality of someone sharing information rather than commentary. Clara had said she hoped Lady Cecily was well and meant about 40% of it, which she considered generous. Lord Hinsley had not visited since the previous autumn, and no one had remarked upon his absence. And in the entrance hall of Whitmore Hall, on the narrow table beside the door, in a small glass case that James had commissioned from a craftsman in the village, and installed himself on a Sunday morning without telling Clara what he was doing until it was done. A pair of old riding boots sat on a square of dark velvet. They were still muddy. He had not cleaned them. She had asked him, laughing, why, and he had said that cleaning them would have been beside the point, and she had looked at them in their case and thought that he was right. Guests asked about them. Everyone asked about them. There was something about a display case in an entrance hall that compelled inquiry, something about the evident deliberateness of the choice that suggested there was a story, and there was always someone at every dinner who could not resist asking. Clara always answered. She told it simply, the way her father had taught her to tell things without embellishment, without false modesty, without the performance of either. She told it the way it had been. A woman who arrived in her own house without announcing herself, who picked up a pair of boots and said nothing and waited, because she had learned that some truths needed time and space and the right witness before they could exist properly in the world. She told it, and people listened, and at the part with the boots there was always a moment of delighted outrage, and at the document room there was always held breath, and at the coaching in there was always something in the room that she could feel without being able to name. James listened every time. He had heard it perhaps a dozen times by now. He stood at the edge of every room where she told it with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize and simply recognized. And when she reached the coaching in part, he always looked at her with that expression, and she always, without intending to, looked back. He told his version occasionally, shorter, less detailed, characteristically efficient. It ended with, "I stood at the bottom of the stairs and said nothing, and then I got on a horse." He said this with the self-deprecation of a man who has made his peace with a specific failure and considers the peace honestly earned. Clara always said, "He got on a horse at 10 o'clock at night and rode 4 miles in the dark, and I would like that noted." It was always noted. On an evening in late June, a year and 3 weeks from the morning Clara Ashford had stepped out of a modest hired carriage and walked into her family's house for the first time in years. She sat in the south garden as the light went down. The roses were at their height. The air was warm and still, and carried the particular smell of an English summer evening, which was the smell of her childhood and her mother's garden, and everything she had carried with her through the years of waiting. James came and sat beside her. He did not say anything immediately, which she had learned was one of his better qualities. He sat with the comfortable ease of a man in a place that fitted him, and she sat beside him with the same ease, and the garden settled into evening around them. After a while he said, "Phelps says the east wall roses want training along the new support." "I know," Clara said. "I told him to go ahead." "He was waiting for you to tell him." "He always waits for me to tell him." James was quiet for a moment. "You've been telling this garden what to do since you were 6 years old," he said. 7, Clara said. "I was 5 when I started listening to it." He looked at her. She looked at the roses. The evening light was the particular gold of summer at its height, the kind of light that didn't last, and she was paying attention to it in the way she had learned to pay attention to good things fully, without the old guardedness, without the habit of holding back. She had been patient for a very long time. She was done being patient now. She had everything she had come for and more than she had allowed herself to want, and the house was hers and the garden was hers, and the man sitting beside her was, in all the ways that mattered, in all the ways that were real, hers too. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers back, without comment, without ceremony, the way he did everything she had come to rely on, quietly and completely, and without any intention of letting go. In the entrance hall, in their glass case on the dark velvet, the muddy boots sat exactly where he had put them. Guests always asked. Clara always smiled and said they had belonged to a woman who had learned the difference between patience and passivity, who had known that waiting with intention was its own kind of courage, and that some houses, some truths, some people were worth every quiet, careful, deliberate day of the wait. She never mentioned that the woman was her. She never needed to. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.